Africa just changed forever. Ethiopia has completed the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, a $4.8 billion engineering marvel that's now the largest hydropower project on the African continent. But this isn't just another infrastructure story. This is about a nation that refused to bow to international pressure, funded a mega project with its own people's money, and just shifted the entire balance of power in East Africa. Today we're diving deep into how Ethiopia pulled off what many called impossible, why Egypt is still furious about it, and what this means for the future of African self-reliance. Because what happened on the Blue Nile isn't just Ethiopia's victory, it's a blueprint for the entire continent. Let's start with the numbers that matter. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GERD as it's known, stands 145 meters high and stretches 1.8 kilometers across the Blue Nile. Its reservoir can hold 74 billion cubic meters of water. When fully operational, its 13 turbines will generate 6,450 megawatts of electricity, more than doubling Ethiopia's current energy capacity. But here's what makes this truly extraordinary. Ethiopia did this largely on its own. While other African nations have built major infrastructure through Chinese loans, World Bank financing, or European development funds, Ethiopia chose a different path. They turned to their own people. Teachers contributed portions of their salaries. Farmers, who barely had enough to eat, bought government bonds. Ethiopian diaspora communities worldwide sent money home, not as investments, but as acts of patriotism. This wasn't just crowdfunding, this was a national movement. The project began in 2011, under the leadership of the late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, who understood that energy independence was the foundation of true sovereignty. Construction continued through political transitions, regional tensions, and a global pandemic. Every year brought new challenges: funding shortfalls, technical setbacks, diplomatic pressure from downstream neighbors. Yet the Ethiopian people never wavered. When international observers called the project unrealistic, when critics said a developing nation couldn't finance such an ambitious undertaking, Ethiopians doubled down. They understood something that many outsiders missed. This dam represented more than electricity. It represented dignity. Building GERD wasn't just about moving earth and pouring concrete. It was about creating capabilities that didn't exist before. Ethiopia had never attempted anything close to this scale. The country had to develop new expertise in dam construction, turbine installation, and massive reservoir management. Local engineers worked alongside international contractors, learning skills that would become Ethiopia's permanent assets long after the last turbine was installed. The location itself presented enormous challenges. Benishangul Gumuz region, where GERD sits, is remote and rugged. Getting heavy machinery to the construction site required building new roads through difficult terrain. Workers lived in temporary camps for years, enduring extreme weather and isolation from their families. Then there were the human costs that rarely make headlines. Entire communities had to be relocated to make way for the reservoir. Thousands of families left ancestral lands, often with promises of compensation that came slowly or incompletely. These sacrifices became part of GERD's complex legacy, a reminder that even the most necessary developments come with painful trade-offs. But perhaps the most impressive aspect was the knowledge transfer. Ethiopian engineers who started as junior participants in the project are now leading experts in large-scale hydropower development. This human capital represents one of GERD's most valuable but least discussed achievements. From the moment construction began, GERD became more than an engineering project. It became a geopolitical flashpoint. Egypt's reaction was immediate and fierce. For Cairo, the Nile isn't just a river, it's the lifeline that sustains 100 million people in a largely desert nation. Over 90% of Egypt's freshwater comes from the Nile, and for decades Egypt maintained near-total control over the river's flow through colonial-era treaties that gave it preferential rights. GERD shattered that arrangement overnight. Egyptian officials didn't hide their alarm. Former President Mohamed Morsi declared that all options were on the table, language typically reserved for military threats. Egyptian media described the dam as an existential threat to the nation's survival. High-level diplomatic missions, African Union mediation sessions, and even backroom negotiations involving the United States and European Union failed to resolve the fundamental disagreement. Egypt's position was straightforward. Any upstream dam that could affect Nile flow was unacceptable without legally binding agreements guaranteeing Egypt's water security. Ethiopia's response was equally clear. No nation had the right to dictate how another country developed its natural resources within its own borders. Sudan found itself caught in the middle. While Sudanese officials welcomed the prospect of cheaper electricity and more regulated water flow, GERD could actually reduce flooding and provide more consistent irrigation. They also worried about sudden operational changes that could affect their own dams and agricultural systems. The diplomatic standoff occasionally turned dangerous. Military posturing and inflammatory rhetoric raised fears that water disputes could escalate into actual conflict. For Ethiopia, this meant that completing GERD required not just engineering expertise and financial resources, but also the political courage to withstand pressure from much larger, more militarily powerful neighbors. Today, 6 of GERD's turbines are operational, feeding electricity into Ethiopia's national grid and illuminating communities that have lived in darkness for generations. The transformation is already visible. For decades, power shortages have strangled African economies. Factories shut down during blackouts. Hospitals operated on unreliable diesel generators. Students studied by candlelight. GERD changes this equation fundamentally. Ethiopia now produces more electricity than it can consume domestically. This surplus creates new possibilities, not just for Ethiopia, but for the entire East African region. Through the Eastern Africa Power Pool, Ethiopian electricity can now flow to Kenya, Sudan, Djibouti, and beyond. Think about what this means. Lower electricity costs reduce manufacturing expenses, making African products more competitive globally. Reliable power enables industries that were previously impossible. Aluminum smelting, textile manufacturing, data centers. Clean hydropower reduces carbon emissions and supports Africa's climate commitments. But the economic impact goes deeper than electricity exports. GERD has created a new center of regional influence. Countries that depend on Ethiopian power become more economically integrated with Ethiopia. Power lines aren't just infrastructure. They're relationships that bind nations together. This shift in energy dynamics represents a broader transformation in regional power structures. Traditionally, Egypt's control over Nile waters gave it disproportionate influence throughout East Africa. With GERD operational, Ethiopia emerges as an energy superpower, creating a more multipolar regional balance. GERD's environmental impact remains one of its most debated aspects, with legitimate concerns on multiple sides. Critics point to immediate ecological disruptions. The massive reservoir has submerged vast areas of land, altering local ecosystems and displacing wildlife. Changes in water temperature and sediment flow could affect fish populations both upstream and downstream. The enormous surface area of the reservoir increases evaporation rates, potentially reducing overall water availability in a region already facing climate stress. Downstream impacts are particularly contentious. Egyptian and Sudanese farmers have historically depended on seasonal Nile floods to deposit nutrient-rich sediments that naturally fertilize their fields. GERD's regulation of water flow could reduce these deposits, forcing farmers to rely more heavily on expensive fertilizers and potentially changing agricultural practices that have sustained communities for millennia. However, Ethiopian officials and environmental supporters argue that GERD's benefits outweigh these costs. Hydropower produces far fewer emissions than coal or oil-based energy, directly supporting global climate goals. The dam's regulation of river flow could actually reduce extreme flooding that destroys crops and infrastructure during heavy rainfall years, while also mitigating droughts that have devastated regional agriculture. The broader environmental question is whether Africa can afford not to pursue large-scale renewable energy projects like GERD. With climate change already affecting rainfall patterns and agricultural productivity across the continent, transitioning away from fossil fuels isn't optional, it's essential for survival. GERD represents something larger than Ethiopian achievement. It's part of a continental awakening towards self-reliance and indigenous development. Across Africa, leaders and citizens are questioning decades of dependency on external financing and foreign-controlled infrastructure. GERD demonstrates that African nations can successfully plan, fund, and execute massive projects without surrendering sovereignty to outside interests. This model resonates particularly strongly in West Africa, where leaders like Burkina Faso's Captain Ibrahim Traoré have embraced similar principles of self-determination. Traoré's administration has pursued aggressive policies of agricultural independence, investing in local rice production to replace imports, building food storage and processing facilities, and reducing reliance on foreign aid. Burkina Faso has also moved boldly in industrial development, constructing the country's first state-backed gold refinery and launching new energy diversification initiatives. While these projects differ in scale from GERD, the underlying philosophy is identical. African countries must control their resources and development trajectories rather than remaining dependent on external actors. What connects GERD and Traoré's policies is their focus on long-term sovereignty over short-term relief. Both approaches have sparked controversy. GERD because it challenged regional power structures, Traoré's policies because they directly confront former colonial powers and international financial institutions. But both have also energized populations that see tangible evidence of what authentic African leadership can achieve. This awakening extends beyond individual countries. The African Continental Free Trade Area requires reliable, affordable electricity for industrial growth and cross-border commerce. GERD positions East Africa to play a leading role in continental integration while demonstrating that Africa doesn't need to wait for external saviors. It can chart its own economic destiny. The completion of GERD offers crucial lessons for African development beyond hydropower engineering. First, domestic financing, while challenging, creates genuine ownership. When Ethiopian citizens funded GERD through personal sacrifices, they ensured that the project would serve Ethiopian interests first. This contrasts sharply with externally funded infrastructure that often comes with conditions, debt obligations, or operational requirements that serve foreign interests. Second, building local capacity during major projects creates lasting benefits. The Ethiopian engineers who gained expertise during GERD construction now represent permanent national assets. This knowledge transfer model could be replicated across Africa, ensuring that infrastructure development simultaneously builds human capital. Third, political courage matters. Ethiopia faced enormous international pressure to abandon or significantly modify GERD. Yielding to this pressure would have maintained regional status quo while sacrificing Ethiopian development aspirations. The decision to proceed despite diplomatic costs demonstrates that African leaders can successfully defend national interests against external opposition. Fourth, regional integration requires new power balances. GERD's completion doesn't eliminate the need for diplomatic cooperation on Nile management, but it does create more equitable negotiations. Egypt can no longer dictate terms unilaterally. It must engage with Ethiopia as an equal partner. GERD's completion marks the beginning, not the end, of its impact on regional development and continental integration. Managing the dam's benefits requires sophisticated diplomacy. Ethiopia must balance electricity exports with domestic energy needs while addressing legitimate environmental and water security concerns from downstream neighbors. This balancing act will test Ethiopian leadership's ability to transform infrastructure advantages into sustainable regional influence. The environmental monitoring challenge is equally complex. GERD's long-term ecological impact won't be clear for years or even decades. Ethiopian authorities must establish transparent systems for tracking reservoir management, downstream effects, and biodiversity changes. Failure to address environmental concerns credibly could undermine GERD's broader symbolic value as a model for African development. Economically, GERD creates opportunities that extend far beyond electricity generation. Reliable power enables new industries, supports agricultural processing, and facilitates digital infrastructure development. But realizing these benefits requires complementary investments in education, transportation, and business development that can absorb and multiply GERD's energy advantages. Perhaps most importantly, GERD's success or failure will influence how other African nations approach major infrastructure development. If Ethiopia successfully manages GERD's benefits while maintaining regional stability, it could inspire similar projects across the continent. If tensions escalate or environmental problems emerge, it might discourage other nations from pursuing ambitious self-financed development projects. GERD's broader significance lies in what it represents for African consciousness and capability. For too long, Africa's infrastructure narrative has been written by external actors. Major dams, power plants, and transportation networks were typically financed by foreign governments, built by international contractors, and operated under agreements that prioritized donor interests. This pattern created dependency relationships that limited African agency in crucial development decisions. GERD breaks this pattern decisively. Ethiopian citizens funded it, Ethiopian workers built it, and Ethiopian authorities control it. The project demonstrates that African nations can mobilize domestic resources for transformational infrastructure when leadership aligns with popular aspirations. This model has particular relevance for resource-rich African countries that have historically exported raw materials while importing manufactured goods and energy. GERD shows how natural resources, in this case, water flow, can be transformed into value-added products that serve domestic needs first and generate export revenues second. The psychological impact may be even more important than the economic benefits. GERD proves that African technical expertise, financial capacity, and political determination can overcome seemingly impossible challenges. This proof of concept strengthens continental confidence in pursuing other ambitious projects that were previously considered beyond African capabilities. Leaders like Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso explicitly reference this model of self-reliance. When Traoré speaks about African nations controlling their gold, oil, and agricultural resources, he's building on the foundation that projects like GERD have established. The dam becomes evidence that African sovereignty isn't just an aspiration, it's an achievable goal. As GERD's remaining turbines come online and its full capacity becomes operational, several key developments will determine its ultimate legacy. Regional diplomatic relations will either stabilize around new power-sharing arrangements or escalate into more serious conflicts. Egypt's adjustment to reduce Nile control, Sudan's integration with Ethiopian energy exports, and Ethiopia's management of its new regional influence will shape East African geopolitics for decades. Environmental monitoring will reveal GERD's long-term ecological impact. Transparent reporting on reservoir management, downstream effects, and biodiversity changes will either validate or challenge claims about the dam's environmental benefits. This data will influence how future African hydropower projects are evaluated and approved. Economic integration possibilities will expand as reliable electricity enables new industries and strengthens existing ones. GERD's success in attracting investment, creating jobs, and generating export revenues will demonstrate whether major infrastructure can catalyze broader economic transformation. Most importantly, GERD's model of self-financed, domestically controlled development will either inspire or discourage similar projects across Africa. Success could trigger a wave of ambitious infrastructure initiatives that reduce continental dependency on external financing. Failure could reinforce arguments that African countries lack the capacity for truly independent development. The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam represents more than Ethiopian achievement. It symbolizes African possibility. In an era when many questioned whether African nations could successfully manage large-scale development projects, Ethiopia demonstrated that vision, determination, and popular support could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. GERD proves that Africa doesn't need to choose between ambition and stability, between development and sovereignty. The dam's spinning turbines generate more than electricity. They generate hope, hope that African resources can serve African people first, hope that continental integration can proceed on African terms, hope that the next generation will inherit a continent that controls its own destiny. This is the Africa that leaders like Ibrahim Traoré envision when they speak about true independence. This is the Africa that millions of young people across the continent demand when they call for authentic sovereignty. GERD shows that this Africa isn't just a dream. It's being built, one bold project at a time. The question isn't whether Africa can achieve self-reliance. GERD proves it can. The question is whether African leaders will have the courage to follow Ethiopia's example, and whether African people will support the sacrifices that true independence requires. What do you think? Is GERD just the beginning of Africa's infrastructure revolution? Can other African nations replicate Ethiopia's model of self-financed development? And most importantly, what would you want to see your country build with this kind of determination and popular support? Let us know in the comments below. If this analysis opened your eyes to what's really happening in African development, hit that like button and share this video with anyone who needs to understand how the continent is changing. Subscribe and ring the notification bell because we're bringing you the African stories that mainstream media won't tell. Stories of achievement, resistance, and continental awakening that are reshaping our world. The revolution isn't coming, it's already here, and it's powered by African hands, African minds, and African dreams. Stay tuned, because this is just the beginning.